Hello, my name is Tony Arrington. Alright, today I'm going to be teaching the concept of absolute value. The standard I'm going to be using is a 6th grade standard under the number sense category, labeled as number 4. First part of the standard is going to be understanding that absolute value is a distance from 0. The second part of the standard is going to be understanding that the distance between two numbers on a number line is the absolute value of the difference. And then the last part of that standard is going to be understanding real-world examples and context. The learning target. By the end of the lesson, students should be able to give the absolute values of negative and positive numbers. They will be able to compare and contrast absolute values of different real numbers also. And they will also be able to give an example of using real-world context. All right, that concludes the standards. Okay. So, absolute value. Just like any other mathematical concept, what we want to do is start with a definition. Okay. The definition, or at least the very most basic definition of absolute value, is what we call the distance from 0. All right, the distance from 0. All right, to add a bit more context, what I like to add is that it's also the magnitude, right, the magnitude of a real number regardless of its sign or direction. Regardless of its sign or direction. Okay. Alright. So, the full definition is the distance from 0, or in other words, magnitude of a real number regardless of its sign or direction. Alright. So, getting started with this, we should create a visual. We're talking about the distance from 0. The best way to give a visual distance in this situation is using a number line. Alright. So thinking about a number line. We start with the number 0 in the middle. Alright. We have the number line going into the right direction, or the positive direction, infinitely. And we have on the opposite side of 0, the line going into the negative direction, infinitely as well. Right, so this is the negative direction, and this is the positive direction. Okay. And now one way to get students engaged in a concept like this is to ask them, hey, if I have 0 here in the middle, think about what would be the first number that comes to the left here. First number that comes to the left, the first whole real number, right? And after a bit of engagement, a bit of discussion, students would likely come to the conclusion of -1, since we're going in the negative direction. -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. Okay. And inversely, in the positive direction, we start with a positive number, positive 1, positive 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. We have a number line going in both directions infinitely, but we're going to cap it at 5 here. All right. So, the concept is actually very simple to explain because it's very basic when it comes to looking at it from a number line perspective. All right. So, thinking about the definition, it's the distance from 0, all right, or the magnitude, all right, of this real number regardless of its sign, okay, or direction. So if I had to ask someone, what is the absolute value or the distance from 0 of the number -3? Okay. And someone who hasn't learned this concept before may not think to use the definition right off the bat. They're just thinking about how far -3 is away from 0. Right? we use these two symbols, like this bracket and this bracket here on the outside of the numbers, right, to represent the concept of absolute values. Right? So when I put these bars here, it's saying what is the absolute value of -3, right? Or what is the distance from 0 of the number -3, right? And an amateur would say -3, right? Because they're saying, well, I started at 0 and I went 3 units to the left, right? So when you ask me how far is this away from 0, I'm saying -3. Right? This would be incorrect. All right, we're talking about distance. Okay, think about it. Can you walk -3 feet? No. When we talk about distances and measuring, like things with rulers and whatnot, you don't see any negative values on a ruler. Right? And there's a reason for that. Right? We can't go in negative distances. We can walk backwards, all right, or we can walk forward, but we cannot walk a negative distance. Okay. So the real absolute value, or the distance from 0 in this concept, would be +3, right? Or just 3. Right? This is 3 units away from 0. Right? 3 units. Okay. 3 units. And the same concept for +3. All right. What is the absolute value of +3? Well, if I start at 0 and I go over to 3, I went 3 units to the right. Okay, so the absolute value, or the distance from 0, regardless of its direction or sign, is 3. Okay. All right, so here we could quiz the students. We could put a few examples up. A, B, C, and D. All right. First example. Absolute value of 2. The absolute value of -2. The absolute value of, or the negative absolute value of 2. And then the negative absolute value of -2. Okay? Alright, so A, I would ask the students. Hey students, what is the absolute value, or the distance from 0 on a number line of the number 2? And I will give them a bit of time to think it over, to read their definition, to reference any books or online resources they have. Okay. Eventually we would come to the conclusion that the absolute value, or the distance from the number 2, the distance from 0, I meant, of the number 2 is 2. Okay? This is 2 units away from 0. Right? 2 units from 0. What about -2? Well, it's just the opposite direction. From 0, right, I went to -2. Right? If it's regardless of direction or its sign, this negative here does not matter. Right? It's the distance that we travel. We travel 2 units. Right? So the absolute value of -2 is also 2. So then we shake things up here. The absolute value of 2, however, there is a negative on the outside. So keep in mind, these absolute value bars are only for the number inside it. So yes, the absolute value, just like we discussed earlier, of this +2 here is still +2. However, we have the negative on the outside here. Okay, so then we just attach that back, because this negative was not subject to these constraints here. All right, so this negative is on the outside here. All right, and that is just reattached. All right, and written as -2. Last, okay, the negative absolute value of -2. Well, once again, we know the absolute value of -2 is 2. All right. However, once again, we have this negative value here on the outside. Basically, this is like -1 here. Basically, this negative on the outside is negative 1 times any number you get as a result originally. So you get negative 2 here. Okay? Alright. Now, if students didn't understand this concept, we would keep reinforcing, keep reestablishing the definition, and keep giving more examples until the concept is understood. Okay? Now onto the conceptualization. Thinking about this in the real world. When I think of absolute values, I like to think of distances for the most part, but you can also use amounts. Think about it. When we use the concept of numeration, we think about physical quantities, right? Things we can physically have and hold. I can have 3 computers, right? But what I cannot have is negative 3 computers. I can't physically possess a negative amount of something. Okay, you can owe $30, which means you're $30 in debt, and that would show as negative 30 in the bank account. However, right, I cannot physically hold the negative $30. Right, that is a figurative, a digital figure. Okay. All right. Now about the distance between 2 numbers on a number line. So how to find the distance between 2 numbers on a number line? All right. So to do that, the distance is defined as the difference of those, the absolute value of the difference of those 2 numbers. Okay. So if I have negative 2 and I have 2, okay. So it's negative 2, and I said the absolute value of the difference of those 2 numbers. Okay? So that's the absolute value of the difference of those 2 numbers. Minus, all right, minus means difference. All right. Negative 2 minus 2 is negative 4. Okay? So you got the absolute value of negative 4. And once we take the absolute value of negative 4, we get 4. Okay, same, we can use other numbers. Find the distance between negative 1 and 4. Right? Negative 1 minus 4. Alright, negative 1 minus 4 is negative 5. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. Right? And that's how we find the distance between 2 units on a number line. Okay. Comparing different values, different absolute values. Let's say I had the number negative 7 and negative 6. We know that negative 7, okay, is less than negative 6. Okay, negative 6 is greater than negative 7. However, what about the absolute values of these 2 quantities? The absolute value of negative 7, alright, versus the absolute value of negative 6, right? Is this equal? Is it less than or is it greater than? Alright, the relationship between the 2, okay? So absolute value of negative 7 is 7. The absolute value of negative 6 is 6, okay? 7 is clearly greater than 6. Okay, so when it comes to absolute values and then just raw numbers, right? If we take the absolute values, we can clearly see the difference between the relationships of those numbers. Okay? All right. And that concludes the lessons on absolute value.